You want to set up your machine with the same thread that you actually made the pieces out of, both in the bobbin and the top, and you want the same color. And you want to set the machine up with the stitch that is called a step zigzag. So you have a zigzag, and there's actually 3 stitches in the middle. So it's stitching as it's going back and forth. You want your feed dogs completely down because we're doing a tack stitch. You cannot do a zigzag stitch. It doesn't hold it well enough. So you have to do this kind of a stitch. Now, this is a machine from 1996 and it has it on it. So most machines have. You'll want an open toe foot. The plastic ones seem to work really well. They don't have the grooves underneath like most feet do. This actually is a quilting foot that I've kind of put on my Bernina here. It has a little attachment and it holds it really well. So whatever works for you, but you do need the piece held. You're also going to be working with a tearaway stabilizer, and this is essential. The connections that we're going to put together, if you just put it under the machine will just eat it up on the inside. So you have to have the tearaway stabilizer. And as it's sewing in the same spot, it actually tears the stabilizer. So it will go away. You don't need to worry about that. There is no exception. You have to use this. And it has to be tearaway. It cannot be normal stabilizer. It can't be anything other than tearaway for it to work right. If you use anything else, stuff will get stuck inside the actual stitch. And this is stiff enough to really hold it. I cut the stabilizer in, what is most convenient for the actual piece. So it will fit your block, and that's what I usually start with. You can reuse these pieces after we pull them off, so I actually sew on them until they're almost shredded. So it's pretty efficient. It really is not a problem whatsoever. And when I start, I always do a little tack stitch to hold the thread so it doesn't get locked up underneath. So that stabilizes it. So we have the 2 connectors, the matching connectors, and you want to hold them and put your foot down on top. And you can use an awl or a stiletto, whatever works for you, but I really like the wood cuticle stick because it has a little bit of grip to it. So if something's not lining up, you can actually line it up properly. So we want to stitch, and I always stitch 5 crosses over or more. If you do anything less, it's actually going to fall apart. So you want to make sure you do at least 5. So we want to go ahead and stitch. You have to set up your zigzag to match the width of your piece. And because this is an older machine, it's kind of fussy. But anyway, so we're stitching across and at least 5 times. And I always have my needle up. Now, if you're comfortable with not and you can just hit your foot, I'm fine with that. I just find it just works better if it always goes up. Then we just move. Don't cut your tails. Don't do anything. Just move it over and make sure it's lined up. And stitch. Okay, and then we move down. Do that one. And oh my goodness, this is so easy. Okay, now the needle that you're going to need to use, I actually have finer embroidery needles. So this is actually a 60 embroidery. They're kind of hard to find, but a 75 embroidery is what you need to use. Never, ever, ever use a top stitch needle. A lot of you are using those. And for this work, it would actually cut your little connectors and they would no longer actually hold together. They'll tear apart. So you want to make sure you use a fine needle and an embroidery. And the reason for the embroidery is the same reason you use it on the machine, is that they're usually heat tempered and they are a ball point and the eye has been polished. So it works really well. So you want to use the same equipment for sewing it together that you used for actually making the pieces. So we want to go ahead and stitch our connector, and remember that it's 5, no less than 5. If you lose count, you can go up to 7. It won't hurt anything. They're not actually lined up really well. So you want to hold on to the one that isn't quite right, and then you can use your stiletto or your awl to connect it. All right, so there's a margin. You don't need to be too fussy. So you want to stitch this down. Now at this point, I'm actually going to go ahead and put my cornerstone on. So I'm going to go forward until it hits down inside, and we pivot around. And one thing that's really important when you're making these is that you don't want to do it row to row. They stretch really bad if you don't make them in units. So the normal unit for a square or a hexagon is I normally just use one block, two sashings, and one cornerstone, because then they fit together really well. We're going to the next one here, and I stitch it down, and give it a couple more. Then we want to go down the piece. Now I don't want to do the corner until all of this is actually set together, because the corner can be kind of wily, so we want it as stable as it can be on the outside before we do that. You want to go ahead and stitch it down. Remember, no less than 5. 6 is fine too. Okay. And wow, that one lined up wonderfully. Now the stitch width is, for this machine, is just about 2 1/4, something like that. So, but you're going to have to find that what works for your machine. You know, every machine is just a little bit different. So we go ahead and stitch that down, and I want to rotate it around, and now is when we're going to do the corner. All right, so I have this piece in here, and we set it in. Now normally I start on the right side because I can see it. See how I can see that? So I go ahead and stitch that together. And you can see why I needed all 3 to be hooked together before I started doing the corner. It just makes it much easier. Go ahead and stitch it down. Okay, at this point we want to turn and line up the pieces. And usually they line up really nicely. I actually went in and pressed them a little bit to get them to where they're in the right place. But you'll figure out all those little things. So. Okay, and we can move down to the next piece. And I've actually run out of stabilizer right here. You can add a piece. I'll show you how to do that. That's why I work in the small pieces, because it's a lot more flexible for wherever I want to go. So when you add a piece, you just want to make sure that your stabilizer isn't double under the next connector. So we just go ahead and move on. Now, I don't know if you've noticed, but I'm not cutting threads. So you do not want the cutter engaged to where you can just cut it. Some of the machines have cutters now. You want to have those tails. It's really important for the next process to have the tails. All right, so we're going to move it down. And you can see how easy this is to put together. The hard part is, well, actually, I don't think there's any hard part. I think it's just getting used to what you're working with more than anything. We've engineered all the connectors and everything, so it's pretty common sense. And it just takes time to stitch them. And like I said before, while you're stitching, you're not doing anything. You can go do all sorts of other things, just like the washing. I've changed to an open toe applique foot. It's really important that you see how the alignment works. This alignment right here is just about right. So you want the stitch to actually connect. So sometimes you have to kind of adjust it just a little bit. Okay. So these are two border pieces and we're going to connect them together when you've got a really bad misalignment of your connectors. I like to start with my needle down inside the loop, and it goes down into the machine, and then I can drop my foot. Okay. And at this point, you can actually use your cuticle stick to get it in the right position. Now, I'm not sure where it left off with the stitch, so you may have to move it over just a little bit. Okay, so let's move it over. So you're using the machine to just hold it a little for you. You don't have to be too fussy about it. I'm very fussy. I get real sideways with it, but that's just my nature to be that way. Right, then we just move on to the next one. So we're coming to where this kind of buckles up just a little bit. So when you're doing that, you want it to sit on top. That's okay. It has to be a little bit bulky at that point because the thread just falls off the edge if there's not a little extra right there to hold it. And especially with this design, it has an edge detail. Okay, so I did a little bit at the beginning, and then I want to move down. On the wider satin stitches right here, you want to do a tack at the beginning and move down and do a little bit of a tack, so it actually holds its edge. Okay. And then we're going to attach these. This lines up just a little bit easier. It's not so much bulk. And you can do just a little bit wider zigzag on these parts if you have, if you're just a little bit nervous about it. I think it's just fine. There's plenty of strength. Now we're coming down to the actual connectors here. I do one right where they come together, right there. All right, now we're coming down to the picot right here, these little pearls. I want to just bypass them. You do not want to stitch in those. So we're going down to the end, and I'm going to grab the one side and with the needle and grab the other side with my cuticle stick, and then put the foot down. Oh, I lost it. Okay, so that's locking it down, and I'm just going to lift it up and use the needle again on the other side. Not all the way down, so I can just kind of shimmy it over. And you want to connect those two. All right. I always finish by putting the stitch on a piece of the stabilizer so the thread doesn't get caught underneath. So the next thing we're going to do is to set these actual stitches. So you want to trim the top, and there's a specific reason why I want you to trim the top first. So you cut it as close as you possibly can. Being real careful not to cut the actual embroidery. Okay, all of those have been cut on the top. Now we have on the back, and I like to get all this debris out of the way. So we have these long stringers here. Now what we're going to do is put fray check on them at this point. And remember, you've got to use a little brush. You don't want to drip it on there. And you want to put plenty. And because the tearaway stabilizer is on the back, it's protecting the front from getting too much fray check on it. And what we're doing is we've cut the front really short, but we're going to leave just a hair of a tail on the back, and it is secured to the fray check. So it actually makes that connection a little bit stronger. All right, so at this point, you do not want to put your iron on that. You want to use a pressing cloth. So we want to heat set it. What that actually does is it sets it right into the fibers. Instead of just coating the fibers, the pressure and the heat actually makes the fibers hold together a little bit better. So we have the fray check on the back, and because we've used the stabilizer, it's only on the back side of the stitches, so it won't show through to the front. And we want to cut the threads. And I don't cut them as close as the front. I just leave it just a tiny tail. If you just slightly tug on it, it pulls the front thread to the back. The next thing you do is you just pull your stabilizer away. And I like to, the angle of the thread goes this way and it goes that way. So I pull it at the direction of the straight line of the thread, and it actually rips a lot better if you do that. So we pull it. Now the corners are always just a little bit touchy, so you might have to get in there with tweezers and pull out that extra little bit. So there was a little bit of the stabilizer stuck on the back side, so I poked it from the front just a little bit so I could pull it out. And that's all there is to finishing up these pieces. That little wonderful little tack. There's not a whole lot of fuss and muss about it at all. We're working on the border piece now, and it's exactly the same as the other. The only exception is this bulky area, so you need to just be a little bit aware there. And you also need to be just a little bit careful with jump strings in between, because you don't want to cut any of your embroidery. Okay, so that's all cut, and then we turn it over. We use fray check and put the fray check on. And you can see why I only use the little pieces. So if I used a long piece or a bulky big old piece, not the strips, it would actually take control. So I like the little smaller pieces. We want to press it, and remember that pressing actually forces the fray check into the fibers and sets it so that you can remove it. Now I always like to remove the stabilizer before that fray check is too dry. I want a little bit of wet so that it is a little bit of moisture, so it's easier to tear. It's just easier to pull it out. When you have these tight tacks together, you need to make sure that you cut the thread that's in between, or else the paper won't rip properly. So there's always a jump thread in between. So you don't have problems with that area. And I'm going to go ahead and rip it off. Now, if you look at it, what happened is it took me a little bit longer to get to it, so it didn't rip as cleanly as if there's a little bit of moisture in it. So, and you might have to go back and clean it up and take some of the paper out. Like there's a little bit of stabilizer right there. If you were doing a color, which I highly recommend, stabilizer will really show. With the beiges, it's not quite as prevalent. So there you have it. It's all connected and ready to go on your piece. We're really proud of our Crochet Inspired Embroidery. If you have any questions whatsoever, you can contact us through our email on SharonSchamber.com.